was planning to say in this conversation was really to thank you, Stephanie, because as I said before, for me, being in Colombia was such a wonderful experience, and it really opened my mind and really got me to see legal education and human rights education in a very different way I was seeing it in Mexico. And that had a really specific impact in the work I do. And the reason I'm back here is because I thought it was very important to other people who had the same experience that I had in Mexico, especially deans from law schools. So we presented a project to bring Mexican deans from different law schools from different parts of the country to visit top law schools in the US. This trip is specifically in New York City. We're visiting NYU now, Columbia, so they can have a similar experience. I know it's not the same for a semester, for a fall semester I was here, but so far they have been very happy and they have opened their eyes. And the commitment they make to come to this trip, because it is funded by the U.S. Department and we are paying for they are paying for everything, was to implement some changes on their curricula, on their teaching courses, and to implement human rights courses, of course. So this is having an impact, and that's because that your work has to do with that. So I really wanted to thank you, Stephanie. And today, what I was trying to talk to you about today was about two main subjects. On one hand, you have I'm going to tell you a little bit about the human rights crisis that it's been happening in Mexico, especially for the last 12 years. And on the other hand, what is the legal education context that we live in, that is in Mexico, because it's a very unique one. And the objective is to discuss about the intersection between these two subjects, so I can justify better what SEAD does to try to solve, to try to contribute to these issues. Because the human rights crisis is probably a very overwhelming one, and a very overwhelming issues, a very complex one, as well as legal education. So I'm going to try to focus on what we are specifically trying to contribute to solve this problem. I know this, maybe this number can bring something to your mind, like, well, at least for Mexico, it's a very symbolic number, and it's because of the case. I guess you all heard of the case of Ayotzinapa disappearing students. And 26th of September 2014, 43 students were captured by local police authorities from Iguala, Guerrero, and were handed to a criminal drug cartel. And the official version of the state was that the General Attorney's Office that investigated the crime was that the drug cartel confused the students with a drug rival cartel, and they burned them in a dump. The families and the civil society organizations representing the families were not satisfied with that answer, and they demand the Mexican government for international help so they can have an impartial investigation on the case. So because of that pressure, Mexican government didn't have other option than to accept international assistance on this investigation, and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights decided an interdisciplinary group of experts that come to Mexico to investigate. And what they found out was the official version of the thing was a lie, basically. It was not possible for the students to be burned in the dump. So they destroyed this official version, and obviously the Mexican government expelled the interdisciplinary group of experts. Still, they have been more than 4 years later, we still don't know where the students are. And the Ayotzinapa case was just the tip of the iceberg of a very deep, serious institutional social crisis that we are living in Mexico. And I believe to understand this crisis, although these are not new issues, but there's a specific moment where this got worse, and it was in 2006 when the government of the President Felipe Calderón declared the war on drugs. Since then, if you look at the numbers, you can look that that the crisis has been becoming worse. As I said, the Ayotzinapa case was just one of the cases that we had in Mexico on disappearance. We have more than 30,000 disappearance cases in Mexico, people reported missing. And although this is a historically issue in Latin America, you can probably go to military dictatorships in the 70s and so on. The truth is that since 2006, 44% of those cases were presented in Mexico. We have more than 234,000 deaths in Mexico. They were considered since 2006 to 2017, collateral damage from the federal government. And you have obviously the cases of feminicides against women in Ciudad Juarez. Mexico is the second country with most dangerous or violent for people for reason of sexual orientation. And if you remove the countries from Syria or Libya or Afghanistan, Mexico is the most dangerous country to practice journalism. There's a journalist from Texas, but he lives in Mexico City. He's quite like a Mexican-American journalist. And when he presented his book about Ayotzinapa, it was called "It Was the State." I think he really catch the dangers of making journalism work in Mexico. He said that in Mexico it was more dangerous to investigate a crime than to commit it. So journalists, probably the killing of a journalist is the most violent way of censorship, but it's not the only one. So freedom of expression is not a right that it's easy to exercise in Mexico. And if I put also economic, social, and cultural rights here, the crisis becomes more complex, because when you look at education, health, and the access that people has to those rights, this is not only a thing that has to do with this kind of violence, but also an issue that has to be with access to exercise those human rights. So what I'm trying to do this, and I'm not trying to frivolize like the discussion with just putting a human rights crisis in numbers, although it helps to frame the problem to really see the dimensions of the crisis. It is to understand this is the people lives we are talking about, and the most important thing is that this is a systematic practice. It is not one case in one region that happened one time. It is a systematic practice, and the state is failing to fulfill his human rights obligations. So in a context like this, and it's very difficult, like, well, me as I also teach human rights in a law school, is how do you teach law in a context that does not respect law at all? And probably the answer is in the same question. And obviously, to respond to this kind of crisis, there's not only one solution. It's a very multidisciplinary problem that needs very complex solutions, but I'm going to focus on what lawyers think it is the best solution, or the legal community, the law community. So the best thing that we thought about was obviously to reform the Constitution. That's the way the lawyers think, I think. If you had a problem, just change the law, and that's going to by magic, like Harry Potter, just going to change reality. And I know this sounds very absurd, but actually that is kind of the legal culture way of thinking in a lot of Latin American countries, but especially in Mexico. And you can see that every serious crisis of the criminal system, the justice criminal system, human rights crisis, we try to solve that by just changing the law and thinking that that magically is going to be a solution for the whole context. And actually, in this case, it wasn't a bad solution. Actually, it gave a lot of tools. We changed the Constitution in 2011, and now I'm going to show you like the main elements that these reform gave to a lot of NGOs that works on the protection of human rights. But the problem is that we only see that as the only thing that we do, but we did not take that into practice. Puts international treaties up in top of the Constitution. The U.S. definitely put them under the Constitution. In the case of Mexico, this reform put the international human rights treaties at the same level of the Constitution. So that changed the whole standard of the legal system in Mexico. The second one was interpretation. What happens when you have two different norms that has two different solutions or even contrary solutions to a specific case that is related to human rights? What the Constitution is saying is that judges need to interpret those norms according to the constitutional and international human rights treaties, and if they don't find a solution there, they have to make the most favorable interpretation to the person, the most protected one. The third one is they establish the obligations to promote, respect, protect, and guarantee human rights for people. I know this sounds very abstract, but it actually gives a lot of tools to NGOs, because in the international dimension of human rights, you can find a lot of development on those obligations, what it means for the state to guarantee access to education, for example. So that's a very good tool. And finally, all forms of discrimination are prohibited. This is known as the suspect categories, and usually you just have gender, race, or social condition or religion as a suspect category. In the case of Mexico, that is a wider categories of suspect categories, and actually has a very wide interpretation, whatever other form that attempts against human dignity. So when you look at this, it really, I can say that really Mexico has one of the most progressive human rights frameworks in Latin America. And if you consider that one of the main elements of the constitutional reform is the international treaty, and Mexico state has signed a lot of international human rights treaty, probably just every international they put them in front, they sign it, although they don't respect them, but they sign it. That gave a lot of tools to a lot of civil society organizations to try to go to courts to win cases on human rights, because obviously this crisis needs public policy, needs a lot of solutions. But from the legal perspective, if you can not go to a court to guarantee the protection of a right, it basically is not a right. You need to be able to demand a court to respect your rights. So this gave lawyers a lot of tools, human rights lawyers. So why this hasn't worked? Why, if this amendment was in 2011 and we are now in 2019, things actually got worse? And there's a main idea two basic main ideas I wanna rescue from this constitutional amendment, besides the legal part or the technical part. The first one is that this has a really deep impact in the way we interpret and apply the law, and as a consequence, it has a really deep impact in the way we teach it and learn it at law schools. And the second one, in 2014, we had a visit from the Special Rapporteur for the Independence of Judges, and then they make a report on Mexico. And one of the highlights of that report pointed out that lawyers, including judges and litigators, did not invoke human rights in their regular daily basis practice. And that was because of two main reasons, according to the UN Rapporteur. It was because there is a cultural resistance to apply to the human rights constitutional amendment, and it was because of the low quality of legal education that lawyers are receiving. So when you look at a constitutional reform at the national level that you see that is all over the media and the political speech, usually you are not going to see any kind of diagnosis of what is happening at law schools. And at the end, those people that are going into law school are the ones that are going to insert in the practice of the legal system. And if you are not forming them, educating them according to those reforms, it's just simply not going to work. So that is what I usually put as a wall. It's not Trump's wall. It's the same joke I did last year. But I think this kind of wall, for me, it represents a crisis. Yeah, a crisis, for me, crises are just, and please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any kind of question. This is, as I said, more dialogical conversation. Crises probably are symptoms that the system is not working, that the system is not providing solutions to the problems that people are living. But crises are also opportunities, and this crackdowns that has the wall needs to be filled with different actors, and the problem is who is going to fill them. And this is where SEAD comes in, and where legal education. I strongly believe that universities and law schools need to assume leadership in this kind of issues, and I think they have a really deep depth in Latin America, especially in Mexico. And now I'm going to tell you why it's more important in Mexico when you have a very unique legal education context. So, yes, I'm going to show you some numbers. These are the numbers of law schools that has been open in Mexico since 1985 to 2015, but I'm going to tell them until December of 2018. Until December of last year, we have more than 1,822 law schools in Mexico. That means that for the last 33 years, the growth rate of Mexican law schools are one new law school every week. For 30 years, we have been opening a new law school in Mexico every week. So now we are Wednesday or Thursday? I'm confused. Wednesday. So by Sunday in Mexico, there's going to be a new law school. And that growth rate is not related to the quality of the legal education lawyers are receiving. And 92% of those law schools are private law schools, 8% are publics, but that 8% captures half of the students that go into law school. So a low quality legal education problem in a public law school is as bad as 92% of those private law schools. And there's also a problem with the practice, because once you finish law school, you only have to go to the Minister of Education and with your diploma, and they give you a license to practice. But also, Mexico is probably the most ethical legal profession, because we only have 2 cases in 100 years of discharging a lawyer for unethical practice. So, or we are very ethical, or nobody's seeing the problem. So how does 1,822 law school look like? You obviously are going to have the elite law schools, like the US, just a few ones, maybe 5, 6 very elite law schools, very expensive ones, where it's very difficult to access. And probably other way of looking at the law schools is like this. You have Harvard, you also have Ivy Leagues in Mexico. You can, if you look at this, you can study, you can be a chef, but they also offer a law degree. You can study both if you want. And this is no law library. I know you are probably not going to confuse with that, but we also have Columbia. But I think this is the way a lot of people see those kind of law schools. But the way SEAD look at them is like this. This is Armando from an indigenous community of Oxchuc, Chiapas. And he is receiving his law degree from the Intercultural University of Chiapas. Those are his parents and his brother, and he's the dean of the law school, and he's a professor of Armando. And SEAD designed the curricula of law school with an intercultural approach that was implemented by Nietzsche, and Armando is part of the first generation that graduated with that curriculum. So there's also a need for higher education that is not being covered properly. And we look at that as an opportunity to increase the quality of the legal education, to incorporate human rights, so we can give better tools to people like Armando, so they can go back to the communities and have, yes, as I said, better tools to demand the respect of their rights. And that's where SEAD comes in. We are a private, independent, non-profit research center that is located in Monterrey City, and it was founded in 2008 with the mission to transform legal education in our country. We try to do that through 5 programs. We have a legal education program that works on collecting all this data: how much law schools are open, how much law schools are closing, how much licensed practices have been handed by the Minister of Education, what kind of legal education problems there have been happening. We have a program that is trying to improve the criminal justice system education, another of cultural legality, indigenous universities, that is the one that I showed you, the case of Armando, that designed this kind of context and an intercultural approach to the law. And we have the human rights program that I'm in charge of, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we do. So this is the work that we have been doing for the last 3 years. We gather an interinstitutional working group with representatives from different institutions, NGOs, and universities. We have people from the Supreme Court, from the National Commission on Human Rights, from Fundar and other NGOs that work very closely in the protection of human rights, and from different private and public universities from different parts of the country. And we discussed for 1 year in Mexico City what was the best ways that we can incorporate human rights into the curricula of law schools. So we designed a model with all the inputs that we received from this group, and we designed teaching materials so we would go to implement it in different parts of the country, in different kind of universities. So we have been training professors in a lot of parts of the country. We're just missing like 8 states from 32. We designed online courses, teaching materials, so professors from different law schools can use them. And we are giving advisory to universities so they can incorporate with quality this kind of contents. So that's like the main core what we are trying to do. Yeah, and that's a photo of a group of professors from different law schools from Chiapas, actually. I put 2 examples of Chiapas because I also like it very much, Chiapas. So what, probably this is the part that can interest a little bit more to Nick, and is, well, how do you design these materials so they can really have a significant impact in the learning, in the process of learning the human rights law to students? And that's where we saw a lot of, we saw a big value on the human rights education program. The program from the UN, it's
the World Program.
The World Program for Human Rights Education. As you saw, that it has 3 components. It has a legal component, a normative one. That is the one that is being teaching in a predominant way in a lot of law schools. We only teach law, and that's not necessarily good. So what we try to do is to incorporate in these teaching strategies the other 2 components. One that has to do with practical education. How do you design a clinical program? How do you incorporate cases, real cases? What can you do to become the classroom, a laboratory to bring practical stuff to students that has an impact in their community. And the part of the values, human rights values. It is not only that you need to teach law students what the law says and how to take it to practice, but it also has a value component to trying to change some attitudes that a lot of lawyers have. So those three components is the ones that you're going to see in every teaching material that SEAD designed. We are trying to incorporate those, and by giving workshop of designing online courses with law professors, we ensure that they learn this kind of teaching techniques and they can use them in their classrooms. And our human rights manual, teaching manual course has been downloaded more than 3,000 times, so it's kind of having some impact. And our online course is in the third edition, and we can only accept 150 people for every edition of the course, and in the 3 editions we have been there's always full our course. So that's basically the kind of work that we are trying to do in the human rights education and the human rights program at SEAD. And yes, that's a very nice picture. After that workshop in Chiapas, the different professors from different universities that came to this workshop in San Cristobal, they came from different parts of Chiapas to take the workshop. And actually after that, they organized themselves so we came back with more things. And this year's Congress is going to be in San Cristobal with an intercultural approach. And I also forgot to mention, we opened a gender program last year. What kind of issues do you have of gender in the teaching of the law and the practice of the legal profession? I'm sorry I didn't put that. So basically that's the kind of work that we are doing in SEAD. We strongly believe that it is not a weakness that we have a lot of law schools. Actually, we see that as a strength. As long as we try to improve the quality of the education they are receiving, and that we are incorporating human rights contents to their curricula and these new teaching techniques that have really had a significant impact on students, we see that as an opportunity to really have a big impact. And at the end, you have a very complex scenario of human rights crisis in Mexico. So you need to look at what specifically things law schools can do and need to start doing, and SEAD is impulsing that for universities to do their job on human rights education, and in that way we hope that is going to have a really deep impact on the way lawyers invoke human rights on their regular basis practice. And I think we have some of the results.